Okay, I'm going to show you how I've drawn this in this tutorial. I'm going to break it down into steps that are way easier to follow than you might imagine, so that you can have a go, create this, and amaze yourself. Okay, so as I explained in the intro, I'm going to break this down into steps so that you can learn about the painting process and techniques, but also about the app that I'm using, Procreate. But that isn't to say you couldn't use a different app on a different tablet and still follow along. Within the app Procreate, however, I'm using their default A4 canvas, which is 297 by 210 millimeters at 300 dpi. And the color profile is the sRGB code that ends in 2.1. Again, it's here within Procreate by default. In terms of the brushes, I'm going to use a selection of brushes, not too many. I'm going to use within airbrushing the soft brush. Within drawing, I'm going to use the Oberon brush, which I'm going to amend, but I will explain that when we get to that point. Within inking, I'm going to use the Studio Pen. Within elements, I'm going to use the Clouds brush. Within luminance, I might use the Light Pen. And finally, within organic, I might use a version of the Rainforest brush. And in terms of the colors, well, I've already pre-selected a color palette suitable for this image. Each of the colors, if we go to the value section here within Procreate, has an area called hexadecimal. And this is where we put the codes in one at a time and press enter. The color will appear up here, and you can just tap it into the color palette area. Now, all of these codes are down in the video description, so you just need to copy and paste them into this box. Or, in order to save you some time, next to the codes in the description is a link that takes you to my Patreon page, where you can download the color files for free. And Patreon is also the place where you can support this channel and gain access to exclusive content, such as extended versions of these tutorials. I'd like to say an enormous thank you to those people who do support me over at Patreon. It really does make a huge difference. And with all of that said and done, we're going to get started. So the first thing we're going to do is rotate the A4 canvas to the portrait orientation. And then on layer 1, I'm going to go to my colors. I'm going to choose the first color on the top row, and I'm just going to drag it into the canvas area and release. Now, right from the very start, I'm just going to make you aware that this image is going to be extremely vibrant, and I might just have to make adjustments as we go along for my camera to kind of accommodate and capture at least somewhat closely the colors that are in this image. So if it appears oversaturated or a bit blown out at times, it's just the camera struggling to try and represent it accurately. If you have downloaded the colors or the color palette or looked at the codes, then you are using the correct colors, so don't worry about that. Next, I'm going to go to the second color on that top row. I'm going to go in with the airbrushing soft brush. I'm going to put it at probably to about the 35%. In fact, no, we'll go for 40. 100% opacity, and just directly through the center, we'll do a band of this color. Then we'll go to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur, and we shall blur that across all the way to about 70% and deselect. Then I'm going to go to my layers and create a new layer, layer 2, go back to my colors. I'm going to use the third color, and we'll just reduce this to about 30%, still 100% opacity, and then just a little bit lower down from halfway, we'll do another band, adjustments, Gaussian blur, and we'll blur that one in quite significantly, maybe 90%. Go to our layers, create a new layer, layer 3, and we'll go to the fourth color, and we will just reduce that down to about 20%, 100% opacity, and then again, just slightly under halfway, we'll do a band of this, adjustments, Gaussian blur, and we'll blur that one in to about the 70% and deselect. Okay, we'll go to our layers again and create a new layer, layer 4. I'm going to switch brushes. I'm going to go to the Elements Clouds brush. I'm going to go to our colors. I'm going to use the fifth color, which is a really nice kind of dark blue. For the size, maybe about 15%, 100% opacity, and then just zoom in a touch, and we'll just start circling in some shapes, some forms for our cloud areas. We just do some light taps. Other areas, perhaps we can just circle it in and get larger amounts of these shapes. vary it up a little bit. Maybe I'll turn it back down again to about 10%. And we're going to again just start to create clusters, these forms. The gaps are just as important. So we've got a collection of these shapes, kind of bands of texture of clouds that just cut across. Maybe we'll turn it down even further, maybe down to the 5%. It can be a bit more controlled. Down in this area as well, you can have smaller kind of little breakaway tufts. Back up again, maybe 8% somewhere in the center of those sizes. And then we can just start to bring that across here. We can use this in more kind of stripes and bands in places. We also have the addition of, once we've created areas, perhaps if we feel that we've created too much of a solid band of it, well, we can always switch to the eraser by long pressing on the eraser. Then when we tap into it, we see we've got also the clouds brush selected using the same brush that we're using with the brushes. So by long pressing it, you've used the same brush in eraser. So that means you can go in with an eraser, set it to a suitable size, maybe 3%, 80% strength, and then you can go in there and you can reclaim some little extra gaps in and amongst the bulk areas of cloud, which is really useful. So again, just reclaim some of these shapes, go back in with the brush, and it saves the settings. So whatever sizes you were using a moment ago, it's still on there. So we're on 8% size, 100% opacity, and we'll just block in this lower area a bigger clump cloud. Again, we can always refine it a little bit. We just get the bulk of it in there initially. Maybe some breakaway tufts down here as well. So we'll turn that back down, maybe 3%. We can have some smaller breakaway segments here near the lower area as well. So we notice the texture up here more, and maybe also down in this lower area. Okay, I'm going to go to that layer. I'm going to tap on the layer and also select Alpha Lock. This is going to enable me to go to a different brush, say airbrushing soft brush, and choose a different color. So I'm going to go for the 6th color. And I'll just show you an exaggerated version of this, but it means that I can cut across all those shapes, but it won't go beyond the boundaries of the blue color that we've already put in, which is great. I'll put the size up to maybe 10%, but the opacity quite low at about 20. And we'll just start at the bottom, and we definitely want to subdue some of that blue down in this lower area. And we want to kind of fade it up. The light is going to be down here, the sun. So it's going to kind of diffuse a lot of that blue away. Just subdue it. It'll merge in, blend in with the warmer colors. So we can just sort of bring that up a little bit further. And just begin to kind of disappear that blue color in the lower area. We could then reduce it down to maybe 3%. And we could almost then start just creating little sections where maybe the underneath of some of these cloud sections are just catching the light a little bit. Again, the sun's going to be down here. So it makes sense that it would just catch the light there a little bit. Maybe the opacity needs to go down for this, maybe 10%. Just a few taps of this just so it catches the underside of some of these clouds. We may do this more dramatically in a moment, but just as a starting point, it's quite a useful way to begin. Then I'm just going to switch to the 7th color, still on the top row. I'm going to stay with the soft brush with an airbrushing. I'm going to put it back up, maybe 10% size again, 20% strength, opacity, and then maybe just in this lower area. We really want to blend it into the glow that's in the background there. So we'll just go over that a couple of times. Well, quite a few times really. Just so it kind of blends in there a little bit more effectively. And that's starting to work pretty well, I think, when you zoom out. I'm going to go to our layers and create a new layer, layer 5. I'm going to go to the little N on that layer, tap on it, and it's opened the blend modes for that layer. So I'm going to scroll down from normal to add. You'll know you've got it selected because a little A appears. Then on this layer, I'm going to go in with the soft brush with an airbrushing. And I'm going to go for the 9th colour on the top row. I'm going to put it to 60% size, but only 5% opacity. So pretty low opacity. And then in the center, but under halfway, I'm just going to start doing 5, maybe 6 taps of that. And you can see it's really starting to build in a nice glow. Then I'm going to go for the 8th colour, the yellow. 60% size is way too big at that point, so I'm going to put it down maybe to 30. Keep it at the 5% opacity. 5 taps of that. Then I might just turn the size down to 15, still at the 5% opacity, and then just in the center, a handful of taps until we get a nice glow, sort of 6, 7 taps of that. Go to our layers and create a new layer, layer 6. We'll also go to this white, so the last color on the top row. Might as well stay with a soft brush with an airbrushing, put it to maybe 6% size and 100% opacity, and then very much in the center of that. We'll just tap that a few times until we get a nice sun that's sort of blazing through. And then we can go to the adjustments, the bloom, and then just slide it across until it just pops into an extremely vivid, harder edged sun for us, and deselect. Now I'm going to go back to layer 5, back in with the yellow, still with the soft brush, but I'm going to put it to 20% size and 10% strength opacity, and just tap it a few more times just to help blend in that bright sun with a bit more of a yellow haze around it. And then you can even just sort of wiggle it left and right a little bit to move across that horizon. Not too much, that's about enough. I'm going to go back to layer 4. I'm going to tap on it again and deselect the alpha lock. Then I'm going to go to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur, and some of the texture of this cloud is a little bit too sharp, too refined. So now we've got the Gaussian blur, we can just slide it across and it will just soften those edges. You don't have to do it very much. I'll put it to about 4% and that works. So you can deselect. From layer 4, I'm going to create a new layer. It is layer 7, but it's underneath layer 5 and 6. I'm going to go in perhaps with the soft brush for this. And go back to my colors. I'm going to go in with the 6th color on the top row. I'm going to put it down to maybe just into the 2% size and maybe about 20% strength, opacity. Just going to rotate it slightly. And then we can start building in some cloud formations that are going to be more distant, and therefore they tend to be a bit more stretched out when they're more distant. So anything that's really kind of round and more distinctly shaped that's in the closer to areas, when it gets into that distant area, it just becomes a stripe, a kind of band that cuts across a little bit more. And we can do bands of this that cut across. Have some little breakaway sections we can still continue to add in, just like we added at the bottom of the upper area. And then I'm just going to switch to the next color, which is the 7th. Continue that. It's probably a better color actually, the 7th color. I think I prefer it. A little less blue in it. Might put the opacity up from 20 to 40. We'll see it just a little bit more clearly as well. It's not just bands that are disconnected, they can clump together in certain shapes, and you can go right across some of these central areas because it won't really interfere with any of the bright colors. It's underneath that glow, so the glow is going to be more powerful, so yeah, it's quite safe. Go all the way across. We don't need to worry too much about the central area because we're going to do a nice big tree that will obscure much of that. Just pepper in a few highlights here up in this area. Don't need to do too much. Okay, we're going to create a new layer above layer 7, so this is now layer 8. We'll keep the sun and the glow above everything at this point. We're going to change the blend mode again from normal to add. I'm going to change brushes. I'm going to go for the luminance light pen, and I'm going to select that 9th orange on the top row. I'm going to have the size of this brush about 10% and the strength at about 30%. And we can use this brush now to really start to articulate some really strong highlights that will form around the edges of some of these little textures and these clouds in the background. So as we have shapes like this that cut around the edges of the cloud, we can imagine that some of these clouds in the background would just have little kind of textures and shapes, and the highlight is just going to really make those edges of the clouds light up. What tends to happen with clouds is it just really highlights the very edges the most. Now it's going to be a little less clear where the edges are precisely when it gets really far away, so you can just add a selection of kind of highlights in here, and you don't really need to worry about explaining or really making it very clear what it's the edge of. As long as you add these highlights in here, your imagination will kind of fill in the blanks. If you do have any distinct shapes, then yeah, use that as a guide, and you can go around the edges of that, and you can start to see the effect it will build in. So just work around the edges of some shapes that have already become quite clear, but then you can add extra highlights even when there isn't a clear shape there already. I might just turn the size of the brush up a little bit more, 20%. And we can just tap this in, keep it quite rough. You can have some lines that cut across, and not really straight lines, but in addition to that, we can add some real kind of points of texture as well. And again, just the underside. When it gets over here and you press lightly, because it isn't in that glow area, it actually presents itself in a slightly less yellow way, more of an orange or a warm glow. And then as you come in here, it kind of changes the quality and becomes more yellow, which is a really nice thing to represent this effect. Perhaps we'll turn the opacity down from 30 to 20. Then it allows us just to be a little bit more subtle, build it up just a little bit more gradually. And you might be able to hear where that it's tapping, it's building it in, just a kind of tap at a time, and doing it as a sideways kind of dash like this, but smaller. Thinking that the light is going to catch predominantly the underside of the cloud, so in a sense that it kind of represents the shapes on the bottom edge of some of these cloud areas. We've got another distinct shape here. We can just go and create a collection of subtle highlights along that bottom edge. Some more here. It's worth spending a little bit of time on these cloud shapes. Clouds are, quite tricky to do. So if yours don't look exactly like this, it doesn't matter. All clouds are going to be a little bit different. Hopefully just using these colors and the general kind of idea of forms and shapes, it's going to start building in a nice effect. And zoom out, just check the progress, see how it's working. I think that's starting to build in the light and the drama quite effectively. I'm just going to bring some more of that highlight across, maybe a little bit higher up. We can have the top edge of some of these clouds highlighted, as well as the underside of them too. You can have both, and that's fine. Do some larger bands of this cutting across in some places too. You can see I'm kind of focusing my energy across the canvas. I don't going to get locked into one place. I think that helps create a consistency of the kind of approach. If you get locked into one area and spend ages just refining one bit, well then sometimes you've created a level of detail that you don't want to commit to the whole canvas. So try and work consistently across the whole canvas and just build up that level of detail more gradually. Now we have upper areas here, perhaps where we should have more highlight in our cloud. We can go up there and perhaps we can just start to trace around the edges of some of these. We don't necessarily want it completely empty of highlights. I think it makes sense that there are some, so just trace around the edge. You can pick up the light a little bit as well. Perhaps I'll turn the size of that brush up because it is going to be a larger, closer shape. So I've got that now at 50%, which is pretty big. So I'm just going to focus predominantly on the underside of this shape. You can have some breakaway tufts as well. It doesn't all have to be completely attached to things. And then just do a couple more in here as well. Keep it a little bit more random. It doesn't need to be as consistently all over, just through some of the gaps perhaps. That's quite big, so let's turn that down, maybe 20% again. Be a bit more controlled. I might just turn the opacity of this brush down to 10%. I don't want it to be too powerful. And just in this area, just bring a few more of these highlights in here, and it kind of blends them together a little bit more effectively then too. I might just go back to layer 4, tap on it and put on the alpha lock again. And with the soft brush with an airbrushing, I'm going to go to the third colour on the top row, 2% size, 20% opacity. And then in addition to the light brush, I can just use this to build in a bit more saturation to that colour, and also it enables me to just go around some of the edges of these clouds without really having to worry about extending beyond the confines of the images or the shapes that we've already created. So it's quite a nice, neat way of doing that. Don't want to do too much of this. I think it's about time we moved on to another element. Clouds are something you can get lost in and just spend an absolute age fine-tuning and perfecting, and I kind of encourage that to a certain extent, but these tutorials, we don't want to spend too long on one element. Got other things we'd like to move on to, so that will probably do. And I think at this point we should move on to the ground area. So go to our layers and maybe go to layer 8 and create a layer above that. So layer 9 now is above layer 8. Go to our brushes and we'll go to the organic rainforest brush. I'm just going to slide and reset it because I've used it previously and changed the spacing of it. So now it's reset, we're going to be able to use it. I'm going to go to the first colour on the second row. I'm going to put the size down pretty low, maybe 2% and 100% opacity. And then we're going to set a starting point for a horizon line and then just draw it across, hold it until it snaps to a straight line. Now, in order to get a perfectly horizontal line, it doesn't have to be judged by eye. So as long as you've held it and it's snapped to a straight line, you can move it around like this, put it somewhere where it's clearly not horizontal, and then with the other hand, just put your finger down. And then it snaps to what is now a perfect horizontal line. Now, I'm not happy with that size of the texture, so I'm going to do it again, but I'm going to reduce it down to the lowest part of 2%, still 100% opacity, and we'll try that again. So we'll draw a line across, hold it until it snaps to a straight line, move it so it's clearly not horizontal, finger down, and let go of both. Now we have a perfectly horizontal line. However, I'm not happy with the placement, so I can go to the transform, it will select the line, just extend it a little bit so we don't get any gaps at the edges, but then we can move it closer to the sun, get it to a place perhaps where we think it's going to work better, and then deselect. I'm then going to increase the size of that brush up. In fact, I'll go to a different brush. I'll go to the airbrushing soft brush. And we'll put that up to about 5% size, 100% opacity, and then we'll just colour up to the very top of that area, just so it blends in with that texture, and then we can bring it down. And obviously we can increase the size, 10% or above, and just block in that bottom area. I'm then going to go to that layer and tap on it and put on the alpha lock. I'm also going to switch to the second colour on the bottom row. I'm going to stay with the soft brush within airbrushing, but I'm going to put the size up now to 30% and 100% opacity, and just in this bottom area I'm going to do a band of black. So it's roughly half and half. Then, to create a transition, I'm going to go to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur. We have the alpha lock on, so it's not going to blur beyond the boundary, but I can blur that in to about the 60%, and you can see it's just created a nice gradient of tone. And deselect. Go back to that layer, tap on it and turn off the alpha lock. I'm going to go back to the first colour on that bottom row, or the second row. I'm going to go back to the organic rainforest brush, and I'm going to put the size of that brush to the top end of 2%, 100% opacity, and then just in that distant area, I can just create one or two bushes, maybe suggestions for trees that are off there in the distance, maybe a bit lower on the 2%, It's already got a bit of a texture, a suggestion of things, but we could just use this now to create one or two more that just stick out a little bit. Now I've started to create them a bit too evenly spaced, so that doesn't look quite natural. So just be mindful of this. So I think sometimes a cluster can work better than having things too spaced apart. So that looks a bit more natural. From that layer, I'm going to create a new layer, layer 10. I'm going to go back to the brushes, still use the rainforest brush, but tap on it once more. And I'm going to change the spacing from 27%, which is the default spacing. I'm going to put it up to maybe about 50% spacing and click done. And that just sort of separates the individual kind of particles of that texture a bit more. I'm going to go to the fifth color, the last color on that second row. I'm going to put the size maybe about 8% and only 15% opacity. I'm just going to start building in some suggestions of kind of texture in here. Then I'm going to put it in a larger size, maybe 15% size, build in a few blocks in here. You want to be mindful you don't go too high up with this. And that just helps create a sense of kind of undulating texture in there that's not completely flat. And that's going to help with the next stages. If you have accidentally gone above that horizon line, just go back in with the eraser, set to maybe the airbrushing soft brush, 5% size, 100% opacity, and then just check around that area, make sure it's not gone too high up like that. Okay, more texture in this foreground before we do the tree. So we're going to go to our layers, we're going to create a new layer, layer 11. We're going to go to our brushes and we're going to go to drawing and the Oberon brush. Now I'm going to reset it, and this is what it looks like by default. What we're going to do is tap on it, go to the settings, and the spacing we're going to change. By default it's 5%, so we're going to move it along to about 40% and click done. And I'm going to start using some really subtle colors initially, so I might go for the fourth color, and then let's set our size to maybe 5%, 30% opacity, maybe just in this lower area. We'll just have some flicks of this color, and it really is subtle to begin with. You'll hardly notice them at all, and that's exactly what I intend. Maybe actually go for the last color, the fifth color, go even more subtle. I'm just building in the hint of texture of kind of grass in this lower area, almost so subtle you won't even notice it, but you will notice it. It'll stop it being a completely dead area. You just keep flicking it up a little bit and that will work. And so that area has a suggestion that there's something there. It isn't just blank. We'll stay on the same layer. We'll move to perhaps the first color on the second row. We'll turn the opacity down to 20% and the brush size down to about 3%. And then we can just start to create some flicks of grass that cut through here as well. We're just concentrating on highlights, so grass, or the suggestion of grass that is just kicking through this area. Now I've put that down to 3%, I might put that back up actually, 5%, have some larger textures of grass that just cut through here. Just flicking it through there. The sun is just catching the top parts of some of these bits of grass perhaps. Let's put it even bigger, so let's put that up to 7%. And that separation of that brush creates the kind of the texture that would be suitable for kind of organic matter grass, different grasses of different types. And we can use the blur tools now to really kind of disguise some of that a little bit anyway. So I'll do for the largest parts of that, so back down to 5%. And then we can just start to move a little bit higher up, add a few more of them. And we'll just keep building up this effect. It's quite subtle to begin with. Then we can reduce it down to 3%, maybe put the opacity up to 30%, start to ramp it up a little bit. And then certainly in this central area, we're going to start to see stronger highlights on the grass. Just keep changing the angle. You don't want all the grass to be exactly the same. It's going to look not very natural. Change up that direction a little bit. Maybe turn the opacity up even more, maybe 50%. or one or two here that's just going to really stand out by comparison to other areas anyway. Still quite subtle. And like I was saying before, we can go back to layer 9, go back in perhaps with the airbrushing soft brush, go back in with the, well, maybe not quite the second colour, maybe go for the 5th colour, 4% size, 20% strength, and we can just start building in some clumps here, some shadow areas, just to create some variation. Doesn't want to look flat. Turn that down, 3% maybe as we go back. There's some textures that just cut in here a little bit from the edge. Put it up again, maybe 7%. Bring in a shadow over from this side, kind of circle it in. Just doing it as a kind of circular tap almost. Turn it back down, 4%. Now, we want the tree to be kind of emerging around this point. So let's just create a point where we want the tree. Turn it back down, maybe 3%. And we could just build that across, sideways, that way. Now, what color are we on? We're on the end color here. Maybe go back one, so maybe the 4th color. Don't want to lose that warmth. You can always go back in there with a red and just increase the warmth of that anyway. Just a few dashes, a bit like the cloud really effect. You know, it's a very similar sort of technique really now, but we're adding texture on the ground level instead. Okay, I'm going to create a tree and I'm going to put it at the very top. So I'm going to go to the top layer and create a new layer, layer 12. And we're going to have it cutting in front of the sun. I might do some amendments at the edges of the tree to help it kind of blend in, but initially it's going to have to cut in front. So I'm going to go to the studio pen within inking. I'm going to go in with perhaps the 5th colour on that second row, 20% size, 100% opacity. And then from this ground area, it's again going to look too saturated, but that's fine. We can always subdue that. But I'm going to build in a tree that just cuts up through the sun. So obviously we need the base of that tree to be a little bit thicker. Then as it comes up, we'll just zoom out so we can see the context of the upper area. We don't want to extend it too far up. And then it's pressure sensitive, so you can press on, create some kind of bends and adjustments to the tree, and then release pressure, and it's just going to get finer and finer branches as it goes, which is great. Maybe another one that cuts off in this direction. And then obviously it splinters off. You can have more branches. You don't need to do every single branch initially. We'll return to this and continue to add more branches. But yeah, you can have twists and turns. I wouldn't be tempted to do too many branches. It's going to look a little bit, or to make them too kind of twisty and turny as well. There's a danger of it looking a little bit too caricatured, almost like a Tim Burton tree in style. So just be a little bit mindful of that. Once you've got a few branches in initially, just go to the edges, maybe just sort out our edges a little bit. Check how it's placed. Maybe we need to bring it over here just a little bit so it is a bit more centered. Okay, that will do initially. I'm going to go to the drawing Oberon brush again. Tapping it, we're going to keep the spacing at 40%, and I'm going to perhaps just keep to the 5th colour on that second row as well. We're just going to put it at maybe about 10% size, 100% opacity, and we're just going to circle in, tap in and circle some areas here for foliage. And you can zoom in, and it's almost creating a kind of leaf, pretty dense sort of fine leaves in here. We're not going to notice individual leaves so much, but we'll just go in and around where the branches are, just tap in some of these blocks and start to build in the tree effect. Now, it's not going to do the whole job for us. We're going to have to go in there and just work on that texture a little bit as well, but it definitely gets us started. So just tap in around that top edge initially, and then as we come further in, perhaps we can increase the size of that brush up to 20%. A few taps of this just to kind of scatter in some textures. We just want suggestions of it, so a light amount here and there. Like I say, up near the top, it's going to get a little bit more dense. So maybe just plug in some of the gaps near the top. And, you know, it started us. It's got us so far, which is working quite nicely, I think. Maybe turn it back down again. 10%. Maybe just a couple of clusters in there as well. Okay. Now, I'm going to turn the size of the brush down again. Zoom in. 100% opacity. So, like I say, I've turned it down. 2% is not small enough unless we put it right at the lowest part of 2%. And let's try that. And that kind of works better. And we're going to have some branches that just, and twigs and foliage that is similar to the grass, but just creates a texture that kind of sticks out at the edges. So we're changing up the direction, cutting through the shapes as well. And when we zoom out, we get a different kind of quality, a different effect. It's more like a kind of bird's nest kind of texture, which is, I think, quite effective. We're going to do that all the way around. Keep changing the direction. We want some of these to stick out on the edges because that's going to be part of the actual look, the effect. I'll just speed through this a little bit. You can always scribble in around the edges as well if you want to create some firmer kind of edges and blocks. Zoom out, check how it's working. I want this to be kind of like a scruffy tree, really. And we could do branches, or almost branches down in this lower area too. It's a little less sharp than the Studio Pen. If we feel we've clumped it too much, we can always long press on the eraser. And then we've got the Oberon brush on the eraser. We can put that to a sensible size, maybe 10%, 100% opacity, and we can just go in there and just create some hints of gaps in there as well. If you want to just slightly depopulate the tree of its foliage, you can do that. Back to the brush, maybe just run through some hints of branches through those gaps so it's not completely empty looking. And I'm also going to switch back to the inking Studio Pen. We have it at 20% size, but I'm going to reduce it to more like 10, still 100% opacity. And then we can run in some branches that just cut through some of this noise. Some finer twigs and branches that just bind it all together a little bit. One or two branches that maybe just stick out on their own. Doesn't have to be a neat edge at all. Now, another trick we can do is go to the adjustments, the liquify. I'm just going to go to the expand. I'm going to put the size maybe about 50%. And there's just an area here. Perhaps I just want to expand it a little bit, make it a slightly different shape. We could also go to the push as well. Again, 50%, and just change the overall shape of this until we're happier with it. You're not stuck with the initial shapes at any point really in digital. You can always continue to manipulate and push it around until you are happy with it. Deselect. Now, I think for that whole layer, I'm going to tap on it and put on the alpha lock, and then I'm going to go to the black color. Second color, probably need to go back to the airbrushing soft brush as well. I'm going to put it to 10% size, 100% opacity, and I'm just going to darken this up initially. Make it a really nice solid black. I think it actually works better as a black shape. Now another aspect of this is the size. So I'm going to go to the transform and got it on uniform. So I'm just going to reduce the size of it slightly. I think it's just ended up being a little bit too big. I'm going to reduce the impact of that somewhat. It doesn't dominate quite as much in the landscape, and I think I'm happier with that. Okay, so I'm going to, with the alpha lock on still, and with the soft brush still, I'm going to go to some of the more vibrant colors again. So I'm going to go for the first color on the second row. Just need to set the size maybe to about 4% and the strength at perhaps about 30. I'm just going to blend in the bottom edge there a little bit. In fact, this whole section of the tree needs to be impacted by the sun. So we'll zoom in. We want the sun to kind of disappear that central area to some extent. Probably need to go more vibrant, so we can go for the fourth color, and then we can just add it to where the sun is and a little bit beyond, probably down in the ground area as well. We can always go back in with the dark colors, then maybe go for the orange, the ninth color, and again subdue that central bit where the sun is going to be, or is rather, for the yellow, eighth color. Turn it down this time to 2%, and we're going to zoom in, and we're just going to chip away at the very edge where the edge of the tree is in the sun. And it's just going to kind of dissolve the firm edge of the tree there a little bit. So I'm actually going to turn it down even more into the 1%, still at 30% strength, just on the edge. We've just got to have it really dissolve that sharpness, that red, a little bit more. And then white, and then, like I say, we want to get rid of that sharp edge, so we can just go along that now and just carefully remove the sharpness, blend it in, so it really has created a soft haze where it meets the sun. Now when you zoom out, you can see the impact of that. It really does give the impression that it has bleached it out when the sun is behind it, and that's a really quite effective look, I feel. Now go to that layer, turn off the alpha lock, and we're going to have to blend in the base of that tree a little bit more. So we'll go perhaps to, well, we'll stay with a soft brush, but we'll go to first color on the second row. We'll put it to 2% size, 30% opacity, and just at the base of that tree, we're just going to blend that in a little bit. Just some taps for texture. Blend that left and right. Go back to our colors, maybe the third color on the second row. And then we can just blend that in. Reintroduce some of that darkness again, base of the tree. Bring that across, left and right. And then probably the fourth color, even darker. Put the size up to 3%. Tap that in a little bit, fade it off. And now you can see now that's kind of sitting in the landscape a little bit better. We can continue to bring some of these darker shapes and tufts down. Areas in here as well. Maybe even put the size up, 5%. Again, I'm not happy with how clumped in that is, so I'm going to go to the eraser, which is still on the Oberon brush. Turn it up, 12%, 100% opacity. Just create some more gaps in and amongst that tree. I think that works a bit better. Back in with the Inking Studio pen and the black. Same settings as before, so 10% size, 100% opacity. And we can just build in some of these branches in there. Don't want it to look empty, but and then if we wanted to go back to the drawing Oberon brush, 5% size, 100% opacity, and just fine tune that a little bit more. Again, just find the right balance of gaps in your tree. Switch between the eraser and the Inking Studio pen. Go in there, find the balance that works best to you. Always needs a bit of fine tuning with trees and branches and these kind of things, and that's fine. Okay, I'm going to go to the top layer and create a layer on top of that. So this is now layer 13. I'm going to go for the Oberon brush within drawing. I'm going to go for the first color on the second row, 2% size, 80% opacity. Just going to create some grass. It's going to cut in front of some of these areas. Now it's going to appear as a silhouette when it goes into the lighter areas, and it's going to be lighter in some of the darker areas, which is, I think, a good contrast and a good blend of the various elements. I keep zooming in and out, just check how it's relating to the different areas. Could always turn it down even further on that 2%, lower, smaller. Change the direction up a little bit. Have ones that cut across, intersect. And this is really just about building up the texture, building up the layers. Keep building up these textures. A good thing about this kind of texture is we can go to the adjustments, maybe the motion blur, and just blur that in across, maybe to 10%. And it's going to soften them in somewhat, and then you can continue to draw on top of it. And the more you do that, the more it's going to build in kind of layers of movement and variety of texture there. So it really works quite nicely. So you build in some sharpness and then some blur. Put the size up perhaps to 3% as we get closer to us. Build in some grass. Keep it quite bold kind of shapes. Don't get too locked in. Let's go in with the smudge. Set to the soft brush. 10% size. 50% opacity or so. And just in the bottom area, just so we don't get any sharp edges there where it joins into the shadows, just soften that in a little bit. I think that works. New layer, layer 14. Still with the Oberon brush, still with the first color, 5% size, 60% opacity, and just build in some really closer to ones just here and there. That is just more foreground, just in this kind of central area, perhaps. Maybe one or two off of the edges too. And then again, adjustments, motion blur, blur them in, maybe 15% of that, a bit more dramatic, and that's creating a nice effect. We'll switch to maybe the fourth color on the top row, turn the Oberon brush down, maybe 3%, 60% opacity, and we can just build in now just a bit more carefully, a little bit more vividly, maybe turn it down a bit more, 40%, just pick it up a little bit here and there as well. And always just keep zooming out, checking. Such an important part of the process to zoom out and check. Don't forget to do that. And then we can just have some sharper bits, perhaps just in this kind of middle distance, just before we hit the tree. Just a few suggestions of this. In fact, I might go back to layer 13 for that. Create some slightly sharper, a bit more in focus in this middle distance, just in this area here. Just cut them through. Change up the direction a little bit. Perhaps turn the opacity down 20%. Get some more of these in here. So we want quite a lot of that. And it is just about layering of textures, really. I think this effect works really well, but you do have to just kind of build it up and build it up. Now we've got this area here that's quite a block of shadow. Perhaps we just need to go in there and just sort of subdue that by adding lots of this grass over the top of it. Just go to maybe the fourth color on the bottom, fill the Oberon brush, put it up to 5% size, maybe 40% or so. One's down in the bottom area here, just for good measure. So again, it's not completely blank, maybe even the last color, even more subtle. We did that before, we're just going to continue to do that a little bit. Put it up 70%, and I think that will do for the grass. Again, back to layer 12, back in with the smudge tool, same settings, just blend that in a little bit more. I think they're a little bit sharp there at that bottom area. I think that works. I might just go to the tree, tap on it, put on the alpha lock again, go in with the fifth color on that second row with the airbrushing soft brush, 5% size, maybe 20%, opacity, and I'm just going to subdue that black. In fact, we'll put that up, maybe 50% strength. Just subdue that. I just maybe want to subdue the black a little bit. It's a little bit strong. I think I want a slightly warmer colour rather than jet black. And then backwards, the fourth colour, as we come further down a little bit towards that sun. And then we'll go for the first colour, again as we encroach on the sun. And then perhaps the fourth colour. And I think that sets the balance a little bit better. Okay, I'm going to leave this tutorial here at this point. I hope you've enjoyed following along. Do hit the subscribe button, leave me a comment, maybe a suggestion of the kind of thing you'd like to see in the future, and I hope to see you back here soon. Bye for now.